Hi guys, it's Michelle, and today's video is going to be a deep dive into the Quiet on Set documentary. I asked you guys if this would be a video you wanted to see, and so many of you said yes, and it's definitely something that I want to talk about more. I feel like we've talked a lot about Dan Schneider, Nickelodeon, kind of the dark side of Hollywood, but so much has come out of this specific documentary on HBO Max. It's honestly too insane to not debrief with y'all, because there is so much shit, there's so much conspiracy, there are so many questions, and honestly it is just really horrifying. So all right, without further ado, let's get into the deep dive of this documentary. Like I said, Quiet on Set was released on HBO Max. It's a 4-part documentary. I believe there is a 5th part coming out today while this video goes live, so today, April 5th. But basically, Quiet on Set, if you haven't watched it already, I highly recommend it. It is very eye-opening and really gives insight into work-life environment was like for child actors, and it is absolutely horrifying. We have talked about specifically the work environments on Dan Schneider shows many times throughout the years. Something that I found interesting from this documentary is that we actually did get a response from Dan Schneider himself, which is something I never thought would happen. I truly never believed that Dan Schneider would ever comment on any of these allegations, especially in the form of an interview where he is on video, and we're going to talk about that later. This all is just super interesting, so I'm kind of just going to go chronologically, just debrief essentially the documentary and talk about some of the things that went down on the set of some of your favorite Nickelodeon shows. I honestly believe Quiet on Set was just scratching the surface of the dark shit that goes on in Hollywood. The fact that I'm still finding out new things about the way that Dan Schneider's sets were such a toxic work environment for not only the children but the adults working there is crazy to me, because again, this has been something that we've been talking about since 2016. This has been years of conversation, and honestly feels like finally people are talking about it on a public HBO Max documentary style platform, which I feel like is going to bring out a lot of other things that Quiet on Set didn't even touch on, that are going to be probably disturbing to hear about all of your childhood favorite TV shows, actors, etc. So if you're anything like me, Dan Schneider's shows definitely encapsulate a lot of your childhood. For me, I personally remember dreaming of being on a Dan Schneider show. I just feel like I remember as a kid making up different bits The Amanda Show, running different bits from The Amanda Show with my sister and acting them out for our home videos. It was just always a dream and seemed like such an incredibly funny and fun experience to be on one of these shows. It really shows grass is greener on the other side kind of vibes. Something that we saw as so cool and exciting to be a child actor had such a dark reality to it, and it's really sad, honestly. So of course we have heard a lot of children who were child actors on different Dan Schneider shows come forward and talk about their experience and how they were traumatized by working on these sets. But something that I found interesting in the Quiet on Set documentary is that we heard from some of the adults working on set and their experience with Dan. Something that I found the most interesting was the 2 women writers of The Amanda Show, Christy Stratton and Jenny Kiljan. Basically talked about their experience in the writer's room with Dan, and it was disturbing, to say the least. Some of the things that Christy and Jenny endured included Dan splitting their pay. He claims that he had no control over anyone's pay, but it seems like they genuinely really believe this, and I don't really know what the point of them lying would be. Basically, these 2 women both applied for this job. He liked both of them. He hired both of them under the pretense of having them split a salary. According to Christy and Jenny, Dan also created a very misogynistic work environment. I feel like misogynistic is kind of downplaying how bad it actually was. Apparently Dan was constantly receiving massages from people on set, mostly women, which is just wildly inappropriate and fucking weird, especially in a work environment. According to Christy and Jenny, he would say things like, can you please give me a massage? If you do, I'll put one of your sketches in the show. And it was amplifying this power dynamic that was already there, because obviously Dan was their boss, but he would kind of say these things in a joking manner, but because he created such an unsafe feeling work environment, because they feared if they said no to Dan or if they disagreed with him that they would get fired. And these are the adults. I think that that was what was incredibly jarring for me, is if Dan was making the adults he was working with scared of being fired by saying no to things that they were uncomfortable with, how the hell do you think the children felt? They were children who are already going to be scared of their boss because it's a scary scenario, you know, but having that on top of Dan actively creating such a negative and uncomfortable work environment where it clearly feels like if you fuck with Dan, you might get fired, is just so beyond wrong to do to children. And the fact that the adults were feeling like this in this environment, I just think honestly says a lot about how the kids must have been feeling, which we'll talk about later. Jenny actually worked up the courage and brought up the fact to Dan that splitting her salary was actually against the rules of the Writers Guild of America. When she did that, she claims that Dan confronted her and threatened her and basically said that if she ever complained about anything regarding her pay, she would never work for Nickelodeon or Viacom again. Again, I feel like it speaks volumes that these were the adults in this situation who were quite literally scared of this man. Quiet on Set, a lot of the cast of all that really came in to talk about their experience. I didn't personally watch all that. I was a little bit too young. Like, I would say Amanda Show is like when I first started watching Nickelodeon. But nonetheless, I guess on all of that, kids were like forced to wear costumes that they were super uncomfortable in. Now looking back on it, they were forced to tell jokes that are very inappropriate for children to be telling. And also, apparently, like this whole section of all that was a dare section, and they were forced to do like kind of fear factor dares that all the kids who were speaking out about it claimed that they were super uncomfortable with these dares. When you watch the videos of them, honestly, it's pretty clear that they're uncomfortable doing these dares. But again, Dan created such an environment that made these kids feel unsafe to say no because they felt if they did, their job would be at jeopardy, that it basically made Dan into this person who had complete control of the sets. That is a characteristic that we see of Dan get repeated over and over again throughout his shows and even to this day, which we're going to talk about. One part of the documentary I definitely want to touch on is the inappropriate jokes. I feel like collectively we've been talking about this for a while, and honestly, the older I get, the more horrible jokes I understand and realize I cannot believe that they put this in a children's show. Dan was definitely someone who really wanted to see how far he could push the boundaries of making inappropriate jokes or innuendos in these children's TV shows. I feel like it is a pretty common concept to kind of have jokes hidden in children's media that'll just go right over the kid's head that are for the parents who are watching. I think that the line here is what's the issue, and Dan repeatedly crossed that line, like to the point where it is absurd to me that Nickelodeon like had people checking off yes, this episode looks good when these jokes were in it. The fact that, you know, a lot of the parents on set didn't speak up because they were afraid that their kid would get fired if they did. It's just insane.
So which one of us is the flattest?
My throat is my instrument. I'm a throat player.
Doesn't count.
And it sounds kind of gross. Come on! Give up the juice!
This shocked me hearing this in the Quiet on Set documentary because, like I said, I loved the Amanda Show as a kid. I always thought a super funny character was Penelope Tate. I thought her name was Penelope Tate, but her name was actually Penelope Taint, referring to the body parts. I'm sure you know what it is. And literally, like, Dan and the writer's room, like, they claimed that that was what Dan's intention was. Like, it was, like, kind of a joke to it. But when Nickelodeon asked, he was like, no, it's, like, tainted, which is just absurd. I can't even, like, that's so gross. Another thing that I didn't notice as a child, because I obviously didn't know what this was, an episode of Zoe 101, which Alexa Nicholas, aka Nicole, who we're gonna talk about a lot later, she's really great and has been speaking out about all of this for years now. There was an episode of Zoe 101 where they are like making these cool backpacks. Nicole is like trying to open some sort of goo thing. We basically see it pan to a shot of it going all over Jamie Lynn Spears' face. Alexa claims that that was like a really traumatizing experience for her because she didn't understand like what the joke was, but some of the boys on set, like, you know, the other actors, obviously understood it and explained it, and she just felt very uncomfortable, obviously. This also happened in Victorious. The cast of Victorious were older. They're pretty much like 17, 18, 19-year-olds. Like, they were definitely an older cast. But in Victorious, the guidance counselor literally squirts lotion all over Trina's face. Like, it's so obvious what Dan was trying to do with this. It's disturbing. A lot of people also believe that Dan Schneider had a foot fetish. This is definitely something we have talked about before. The Sam and Cat Twitter account literally tweeted asking its followers, which were obviously mostly children, to send in photos of their feet with like hashtag Sam and Cat written on them, which is just crazy. Why else would you be asked? Like, why? Nickelodeon's logo was even a foot for some time, but I don't know if Dan actually like had rights over Nickelodeon's logo, but weird coincidence. Also, many people recount that Dan would take photos of the children's feet on set. Like, they would just like go up to the children and be like, I'll give you $5 if you let me take a picture of your foot, like on a digital camera. Honestly, the Quiet on Set documentary really pointed out how many innuendos there were throughout all of Dan's shows. Like, consistently, he was just trying to push that boundary of what he could post. And it's disturbing, considering who his audience is and who these actors are that he is basically coercing into saying or doing very inappropriate things for a child to be doing. I think the most damning shit was the slap.com. I cannot believe that I didn't realize how weird this was as a child. Obviously, I was a kid too, so I get it, but I have been obsessed with Ariana Grande for like over 10 years at this point. Pretty much since Victorious came out. So I would always watch Kat Valentine's videos on the Slap, and I never thought anything weird of them. But when they were playing them on Quiet on Set, there were so many things I was like, what the hell were they thinking? Having Ariana squeezing a potato, saying like, give up the juice. So many jokes that just like went over my head. Ariana putting her foot in her mouth, her pouring water on herself upside down. It's just so many things that are just so disgusting that Dan absolutely knew exactly what he was doing when he was doing that. I'm gonna say that. Allegedly. I don't know. And while these things were not going directly on Nickelodeon, fans of the show were always going to the Slap and iCarly.com, like, just to watch extra content. Honestly, I feel like Dan was able to push the boundaries even more with this content because he was essentially making Ariana a cam girl, which is absurd. There's honestly no other way to really look at it. And again, these are shows for children. People who are filming these videos and TV shows are children. I said the Victorious cast was a little bit older. I feel like Ariana was probably 17, 18 at the time. That's still a child, like 18 to 19. Even 20 is so young. Your boss is who you're afraid of is telling you this. Even if you feel uncomfortable, you don't feel like it's worth the risk of saying no or telling them that they feel unsafe or uncomfortable because they were scared of being fired. But now I want to talk about some of the different people who have spoken out and some other people who haven't. We're going to start with Jeanette McCurdy. I feel like we've talked about her a lot, and she's someone who is kind of like a whistleblower for regarding her experience on set with Dan. Jeanette did so in her book, I'm Glad My Mom Died, where she basically detailed the experience that she had working on set with Dan Schneider and how he would scream at her, verbally abuse her and the other kids. He would constantly pin the iCarly kids against the Victorious kids, which, like I said, they were all teenagers at the time. And apparently Dan would be like, you iCarly kids are so lame, like, you guys don't get drunk, like, the Victorious kids are way more fun and like getting drunk, like, whatever. And I'm like, these are underage kids, like, they're like 19. Why are you giving them alcohol as an adult that is their boss? That's fucking nuts. Jeanette claims that he overall created a very unsafe environment, telling Jeanette that she would be nowhere without him. She'd be working at Yogurtland, like, if it weren't for his shows. And again, just reiterating the fact that he was making these sets places that were unsafe for children to say that they were uncomfortable, which I think is such an important point that we need to drive home. Jeanette also claimed in her book that Nickelodeon offered her $300,000 of hush money to never speak about negative experiences with Dan on the set of any Nickelodeon shows. And I know, like, a lot of people would probably accept this money, and maybe a lot of people have, and that is kind of a scary point. Next person I want to talk about, like I said, Alexa Nicholas played Nicole on Zoe 101. Her sharing her story has made so many other people feel safe to share theirs. She has been talking about her experience with Dan for years. And again, she's another child actor who recalls her time on Nickelodeon being an extremely traumatic event. She was dealing with bullying from her co-stars Jamie Lynn Spears and Victoria Justice, but also from Dan Schneider. Dan would constantly scream at Alexa, and she was experiencing bullying from her other co-stars and was basically like, hey, like, I'm experiencing this bullying. And instead of, like, helping the situation, he basically screamed at her and said, this isn't Nicole 101, no one cares about you. Crazy thing to say to a kid. Alexa got to the point where she would literally feel so sick to her stomach to go on set that she had to quit. Like, give up her dream job because of the treatment that she was experiencing from Nickelodeon. A lot of these kids on the Quiet on Set documentary talked about how a lot of them were supporting their family financially. So they not only had the pressure of, like, losing their dream job, also the pressure of keeping their family afloat and, like, feeling like they had to keep their job, they had to keep Dan happy. That's a very dangerous environment. Drake Bell is someone I also want to talk about. His experience, I think it shocked a lot of people. Basically, he was revealed to be the victim of child SA from his dialogue coach, Brian Peck. Brian Peck was someone who worked very closely with Dan Schneider. He was on several sets of his shows and even acted in some of them. Infamously, the pickle guy on all that. And when I watched some of these scenes, I'm like, this is so disturbing, especially knowing what we know now about Brian Peck. Like, it's disgusting. Brian Peck grew very close with Drake Bell, would constantly take him to Disneyland, and he was always calling him, bringing him to auditions, etc. He ended up assaulting Drake, and I can't even imagine how terrifying this must have been. Drake was like 14, 15 years old at the time, and he was terrified. He didn't tell anyone what had happened to him and still continued having to see Brian Peck very often, because if he didn't, he was scared that that would raise questions and then he would have to talk about it. So he ultimately kept quiet until he was actually at his girlfriend's house, and Brian Peck kept calling Drake over and over again. He wasn't answering his phone. Then Brian Peck kept calling Drake's girlfriend's house. This is her parents' house. And her mom is, like, answering this phone being like, yeah, like, Drake's here. She let him talk to Drake. Drake was like, no, like, I'm not gonna come over. Like, we're not gonna go to Disneyland today. Hung up. Then Brian Peck just kept calling over and over and over again. And this was obviously a red flag. Drake's girlfriend's mom, who then ended up pulling Drake aside and asked if anything happened with Brian and if he ever hurt him in any way, and Drake eventually ended up telling her the truth. Then Drake went on to tell his own mother, and once they did, filed a police report, and it was 2003 at the time. Brian Peck was arrested, and everyone knew that he had assaulted a child actor, but no one knew that it was Drake. No one knew this until 2024. This is over 20 years later.
It wasn't dealing with anybody on the shows or anything, right?
It was a child actor.
On one of our shows?
Yes.
It's just so sad, and I'm happy that Drake felt like he could share his story. Drake actually claimed that Dan Schneider was very supportive of him during this time. I guess Dan called him up and was like, hey, like, was this you? And a lot of people are thinking it's weird that Dan knew that, but I guess, like, if Dan was so involved with all of his shows, he was probably aware of all the time that Brian Peck was spending with Drake. Like, I feel like it was not that crazy of a conclusion to come to. Like, obviously the public and the media and most people probably wouldn't have known that they were spending so much time together, which is why the victim ended up going on as anonymous for so long. But Drake claims that Dan was very supportive of him and wanted to make sure he was safe and okay. And I will say this, like, I feel like a lot of people were kind of shocked that, you know, Drake had such a good experience with Dan when a lot of other people didn't. Just because Dan was supportive towards Drake, he could also be abusive towards other people. Like, they both can exist in the same reality. It doesn't mean that either is a lie. Something crazy to me that I learned from the Quiet on Set documentary was after Brian Peck was released, which the fact that he was fucking even released, like, why are these people not in prison for life? Like, I don't understand that. He went on to still work with children. He actually worked on the set of Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, another one of my favorite TV shows. That is insane. Like, actually fucking nuts. It's really disturbing to process, honestly. The next person I want to talk about is Jamie Lynn Spears. So Jamie Lynn is another female actress that Dan really took under his wing and made into a star. It's been a conspiracy theory for years that the real father of Jamie Lynn Spears' child that she had at 16 years old was actually Dan Schneider. At the time, Jamie Lynn had an on and off relationship with her boyfriend Casey Aldridge, who she still claims is the father of her daughter Maddie. But fans have speculated for years that this was actually not true, and basically a blind item like gossip blog called Crazy Days and Nights, which turned out to be apparently a very reputable source, posted a blind item about this in 2007, basically claiming that Casey Aldridge was paid off by Nickelodeon and Dan to claim to be the father of Jamie Lynn's baby, when in reality it was allegedly Dan Schneider. I feel like there's no way that if we're gonna know that this is true or not, but I feel like with the other information we're seeing circling, honestly makes the whole theory seem like it's not that far-fetched and crazy. Like, I really hope that this is not true. Apparently this blind item, like, author is very reputable Hollywood attorney who would have access to this kind of information. So, I don't know, I guess take what you want and believe what you want out of that, but it is just a theory. Amanda Bynes is, like, the last person I want to talk about. I feel like when you think of Dan Schneider, you think of Amanda. Like, that is, I think, like, the most famously associated actor with Dan. And Amanda was discovered by Dan at the Laugh Factory on Sunset Boulevard at just 10 years old, and he immediately made her his new protege with The Amanda Show, because we see and hear, you know, the Quiet on Set documentary, hearing all of the children speak out about their traumatizing experiences on set with Dan, and knowing that Amanda has been experiencing that since she was 10 years old is just insane. And it makes watching her publicly struggle that much harder, because it just is like, what trauma did this girl go through? A lot of people claim that Amanda and Dan were uncomfortably affectionate. Like, Amanda would always be massaging Dan or like wrapping her arms around him. He would always be like cuddling up to her. Weird vibe. So when the allegations about Dan Schneider started to come out about how he was kind of a creep overall, a blind item came out that a lot of people think is from Amanda Bynes, and it said, quote, "Thank you all for your ongoing support. I don't know how any of these men sleep at night, but if there's one thing I do know, what's done in the dark always comes to light. XOXO." And if you take all the letters that this person specifically capitalized, it says Dan did it. She goes on, "Sorry, I thought that was clever. Unfortunately, I will obviously not be making any comments whatsoever for obvious reasons, and unfortunately, I feel as though the only way that legitimate stories can make the headlines regarding the producer is if other people publicly speak on his behavior. The producer was truly like a second father to me, but things changed. After the second incident, I don't know if I'll ever be able to have children or have a family of my dreams. People have been picking this scab for years. I just won't be the one who finally rips it off." So a lot of people were kind of questioning what she meant by that exactly. And many people believe that Dan impregnated Amanda at a super young age, like 13, and she was forced to like get an abortion. Not at all claiming that that's true. Really hoping that it's not, because that's freaking disturbing. But I guess there was a rumor with a Twitter account that claimed to be Amanda that was saying all of this stuff. I don't know. Obviously, we don't know if anything is true. She's definitely been through a lot. Amanda Bynes' story is the one that remains untold, and I think when she tells it, if she ever does, if she ever wants to, that will be when a lot of shit hits the fan. Because I'm sure there is some dark shit that she has not expressed yet. Overall, I think one of the most interesting things about the Quiet on Set documentary was Dan's response himself. So pretty immediately after the documentary dropped, he did a sat-down interview with Boogie Bowman, who was from iCarly. He played Tebow. Tebow is an iconic character, but this interview rubbed me the wrong way. also rubbed Alexa Nicholas the wrong way. I listened to like her opinion on it, and honestly, I have to agree. For one, Dan was invited to do Quiet on Set. I feel like if he genuinely felt bad about the way that he treated people, he should have sat down with Quiet on Set and done documentary in a respectful way, but instead he chooses to do an interview after where he can completely control the narrative. He even like so blatantly is using Boogie to like justify his actions in a way. He was like, you know what it was like on my sets, or you know how I am, or you know how this is, like whatever. He was just very dismissive about a lot of his behavior, and I felt like he was only taking accountability because he had to, and he really wasn't even taking accountability. He was kind of like working around. He honestly acts like a covert narcissist. If like I have ever seen one, it's that. Apologizing for your own benefit vibes. There is something very off about this interview. For example, you know, Boogie brought up the massages and he was like, I would never do that now. I can't believe I did that then. And I'm like, no, Dan, you would do that now. The reason that you wouldn't do that now is because people have stepped up in, like, obviously this was like the 90s, early 2000s. People have since stepped up and been like, men are treating women inappropriately in the workplace. So yeah, that's the reason that you stopped doing it. Not because you thought it was wrong, but because other people thought it was wrong. Basically kind of said about the whole jokes thing, he was like, if anyone was uncomfortable with the jokes or the dares, they could have told me and I would have cut it and not had them do it. Which is upsetting to hear him say, because we know that he created an environment that was so unsafe for these children to express their actual feelings and say no to things that they didn't want to do because they had a fear of getting fired. Those two things don't coexist. He created that environment. So yeah, he could say, oh, that you could have said no. You can't say that when you create an environment where you can't say no without fear of getting fired. Like, that's crazy and manipulative. Another covert narcissist tactic. Only thing that felt authentic about that interview, I will say, was the way that he reacted to Drake and Brian Peck. And I think that's because that is a genuine reaction. I think he genuinely feels bad that that happened to Drake, because it's terrible, of course. It's point blank. A lot of the, Dan Schneider shit was about him pushing the boundaries. This was a point blank horrible thing that happened to a child that was introduced to this dialogue coach by Dan. I believe that he felt guilty about that and he was crying about it. It felt authentic. But like I said, two things can exist at once, because he was feeling guilty for that, but not really addressing the way that he treated people on his sets, and that is disturbing to me, because he didn't mention anything about Janelle McCurdy, Alexa Nicholas, any of the people who have been speaking out about the fact that this man has been horrible to them and was screaming at them as children. He didn't say boo about that. Nothing. He pretty much was just like, I shouldn't have acted that way. I would definitely do it differently now. I'm like, yeah, you would do it differently now because now you don't have a job. You would do it differently now because it's in your best interest to. It's disturbing, and literally the only thing I agreed with that Dan said was that there should be therapists on set at all times when there are children involved with a show or a movie. And I agree with that 100%, but it should be in their contracts that if a child feels uncomfortable with something or doesn't want to do something, that they should be able to say no without the fear of being screamed at by their director, by their superiors, or being fired and losing their job. That should point blank be a thing. And Dan never created that safe feeling environment, and that is why so many of these children have such traumatic experiences. And not just children, the adults working on these sets as well. Traumatic experiences, and honestly, it's just horrible. It is so sad. There's way too much disturbing stuff going on, and honestly, I feel like Dan Schneider, that's just scraping the surface. Probably so much more buried underneath. I would love to hear your guys' opinions and thoughts about the documentary, but that is it for today's video. If you guys liked it, please give it a big thumbs up. Like I said, let me know in the comments below what you guys thought about this, and any other thoughts on Quiet on Set. I want to hear them, but that is it. And make sure you follow me on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, and subscribe for new videos every week, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.